Welcome to the chaotic, muddy, and slightly smelly beginning of the Middle Ages. In this video, we'll walk you through the grand collapse of the Western Roman Empire, aka that time when Europe hit the reset button, but forgot to read the instructions. Before we dive into the sword fights, plagues, popes, and peasants, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us where and when you're watching. Are you in a cozy cafe at 3 p.m., hiding under your blanket at midnight? Either way, prepare for a roller coaster of history. Spoiler alert, it involves a lot of mud, mysterious monks, and extremely pointy helmets. Let's travel back in time to a world where Wi-Fi doesn't exist, but feudal lords do. Ready? Let's go. The Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in 476 AD. And no, it didn't go out with a dramatic battle or a final speech like in the movies. It was more like someone quietly turning off the lights and slipping out the back door. Rome, once a proud superpower with straight roads and straight faces, crumbled under the weight of bad emperors, lazy armies, and far too many invading guests. After Romulus Augustulus, bless his name, was sent into retirement, Europe found itself leaderless, confused, and kind of dirty. Without the Roman vacuum cleaner keeping things tidy, everything fell apart. Roads broke, trade died, bandits thrived, and people started building weird wooden forts instead of majestic stone cities. Welcome to the dark, but weirdly entertaining, first step into the Middle Ages. With Rome out of the picture, Europe basically became the world's weirdest group project, without a leader, without a plan, and with way too many people trying to take control. Enter the Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, and a few more with names that sound like heavy metal bands. Each tribe saw a slice of the crumbling pie and said, "Yep, that's mine now." The Visigoths took Spain, the Vandals grabbed North Africa, and the word vandalism was never the same again. And the Franks made themselves comfortable in modern-day France. Meanwhile, locals just tried to figure out who they now paid taxes to, if anyone. Europe was turning into a messy roommate situation. Too many tribes, not enough furniture, and no one cleaning up after themselves. After the fall of Rome, Europe didn't get a peaceful transition. Nope. It was more like pulling out the Jenga block that makes the whole tower collapse. With no central government, everything turned into a medieval version of every man for himself. Local warlords popped up like mushrooms after rain, each one declaring, "I'm in charge here," usually while waving a sword dramatically. Towns had their own rules, currencies, and occasionally their own king, usually a guy with a nice beard and 5 cousins in the militia. Communication? Forget it. If you traveled 30 kilometers, people spoke a dialect you'd never heard of, and they might throw a chicken at you just for looking funny. It was chaos. Romantic chaos, sure, but chaos nonetheless. Out of the chaos, new kingdoms started popping up like medieval startups. The Franks set up shop in modern-day France, led by a guy named Clovis. Think of him as the medieval version of a bold entrepreneur, except with more chainmail and fewer spreadsheets. Meanwhile, the Visigoths cozied up in Spain, the Ostrogoths lounged in Italy, and the Anglo-Saxons took over rainy Britain. Each group was busy stamping their name on the land, scribbling laws, collecting taxes, sometimes in goats, and throwing the occasional feast to show off their power. These were the early days of what would become Europe's major powers. No one knew it at the time, of course. They were too busy arguing over borders, livestock, and whose beard was more regal. While kings were busy grabbing land and arguing over goats, another power quietly rose, one without swords but with serious influence, the Catholic Church. As the Roman Empire faded into the background, the Church stepped up like a substitute teacher who suddenly becomes principal. With its network of bishops, monks, and priests, the Church became the glue holding Europe's chaos together, more or less. People looked to the Church not just for salvation, but also for advice, justice, weather predictions, and the occasional miracle. And unlike local warlords, priests actually knew how to read. That alone gave them near magical status. Slowly but surely, the Church built up its power base, brick by brick, hymn by hymn, until even kings started asking, "Hey, do I need the Pope's blessing for this war?" In a world where warlords bickered and bandits roamed, there was one place where silence reigned, books were treasured, and the loudest sound was a monk sneezing. Welcome to the medieval monastery, a fortress of knowledge amid the chaos. While everyone else was busy fighting over goats, monks were quietly copying manuscripts by candlelight, preserving ancient texts no one else could read. They woke up at sunrise, prayed, gardened, wrote, and probably invented herbal tea before it was cool. These monasteries were the libraries, schools, and Google Drives of the Middle Ages. Without them, half of ancient knowledge would have been lost to time, or used as kindling by someone cold and illiterate. So next time you drink tea while reading a history book, raise your mug to the monks. Enter Charlemagne, a man with a name that sounds like a luxury perfume, but who ruled like a steamroller in chainmail. Crowned as emperor in 800 AD, he didn't just want to be king of the Franks, he wanted the whole "let's fix Europe" package. Charlemagne built schools, reformed laws, and even tried to standardize handwriting. Yes, you heard that right. The guy cared about fonts before it was trendy. Under his rule, the Carolingian Empire became a rare bright spot in the murky Middle Ages. People called him Father of Europe, though he probably had enough real kids to start a soccer team. With brains, brawn, and a beard that could part a river, Charlemagne gave Europe a much-needed reboot, until it all fell apart again, of course. But hey, nice try. Imagine this. You're a medieval king. You have a shiny crown, a suspiciously pointy sword, and a kingdom full of muddy fields. But how do you convince people to obey you? Easy, you say. God told me I'm in charge. Boom. Divine right of kings. The idea was simple and very convenient. Kings were chosen by God, so disagreeing with them wasn't just rude, it was heresy. This holy stamp of approval made rulers untouchable, even when their decisions involved things like banning dancing goats or taxing eyebrows. Of course, the church loved it too. The more divine the king looked, the more powerful the pope felt. It was a match made in heaven, literally. Until, of course, kings and popes started fighting like siblings over who got the bigger slice of divine cake. So how do you run a kingdom when roads are broken? The mail system is just a guy with a donkey, and your army is busy arguing over soup. Easy, you invent feudalism. Kings handed out land like party favors to nobles, saying, "Here, take this swamp, and in return, swear loyalty and send me soldiers." Thus began the great medieval land for loyalty exchange program. Lords became mini-kings of their own manors, and the pyramid of power was born. King at the top, nobles below, knights under them, and peasants at the bottom, carrying everyone else, and occasionally the manure. Feudalism wasn't efficient, fair, or clean, but it kept things somewhat stable, at least until everyone started fighting again over whose castle was bigger. Just when Europe thought things couldn't get any messier, boom, Vikings. These weren't your average tourists. No cameras, no postcards, just axes, longships, and a tendency to show up uninvited. From the late 8th century, these sea-savvy Scandinavians became every coastal villager's worst nightmare. One minute you're milking a goat, the next, surprise, your monastery is on fire. Vikings looted, burned, and occasionally settled down when they got tired or cold. Their ships were so fast and silent that by the time you heard them, it was already too late. Kings built watchtowers, towns built walls, and peasants built excuses to sleep in their boots. The Viking Age was loud, brutal, and definitely not sponsored by any travel agency. When Rome fell, so did the roads, cities, plumbing, and, tragically, the public baths. In their place, fields of wheat and cabbage took over. Welcome to the agricultural reboot of Europe. With no central empire left to organize things, people turned to the one thing that didn't collapse: dirt. Villages sprouted where cities once stood, and survival meant waking up with the rooster, plowing with oxen, and praying it wouldn't rain during hay season. The Roman stone aqueducts were replaced by wooden buckets, And grand libraries gave way to barns with goats. It wasn't glamorous, but at least everyone got good at growing turnips. The glory of Latin faded into local dialects, and slowly, a new rhythm of life began. Grow food, store food, eat food, repeat. While kings were busy sword fighting and Vikings were busy boat burning, someone else quietly climbed the ladder of power. The Pope. Yes, the man in the pointy hat started as a humble spiritual leader, but soon found himself acting more like a CEO of medieval Europe, minus the Zoom calls. As political chaos swirled, people looked to the Pope for order, wisdom, and sometimes weather advice. And since he spoke on behalf of God, officially, even kings had to think twice before ignoring him. Over time, the Pope's power grew so much that some called him the real emperor, just with holier robes. Thus began a long era where religion and politics danced an awkward but powerful waltz across the continent. If medieval society had Instagram, castles would be all over your feed. These massive stone fortresses weren't just homes. They were the medieval equivalent of verified status. Built on hills, cliffs, or wherever the view screamed, "I'm important." Castles served as military bases, administrative hubs, and giant ego boosters. Inside, you had drafty halls, echoey corridors, and enough armor to start a fashion line called chainmail chic. Outside, moats, drawbridges, and guards who were 50% muscle and 50% boredom. But a castle wasn't just a fortress, it was a symbol. If you lived in one, you were clearly somebody. If you looked at one from the field below, well, time to get back to plowing. If peasants had blisters, nobles had banquets. The medieval aristocrat's life was a delightful cocktail of feasting, hunting, gossiping, and scheming, all served with a side of roast boar. Their calendars were full: today a wedding, tomorrow a hawking trip, and next week, an arranged marriage that doubles as a land deal. Castles echoed with music, clinking goblets, and occasional arguments over who had the bigger estate. Politics was often played at the dinner table, between sips of wine and bites of pheasant. Beneath all the velvet and jewels, though, was a constant game of who can marry richer and rise faster. Because in the world of nobles, love was optional, but alliances were everything. The knight, part warrior, part fashion statement. Dressed head to toe in shiny armor and trained to fight, serve, and occasionally recite poetry. Badly, knights were the rock stars of the medieval world, just with more rust. Becoming a knight wasn't easy. First, you had to start as a page, then a squire, and only after years of polishing other people's swords could you finally get your own. Their code of chivalry demanded bravery, loyalty, and a heroic mustache, optional but encouraged. Knights fought in battles, jousted at tournaments, and swore fealty to their lords, unless they got distracted by a pretty noblewoman or a roast pig. They were brave, bold, and occasionally too heavy to get back on their horse without help. Being a medieval peasant was basically playing life on hard mode, with no save points. From sunrise to sunset, peasants and serfs worked the land, planting, harvesting, feeding animals, and somehow still having enough energy to pay taxes. Lots of taxes. There was the grain tax, the pig tax, the using the Lord's oven tax, and possibly even a breathing near the castle tax. And unlike nobles, peasants didn't throw feasts. They threw out their backs. Their homes were small, their beds were straw, and vacations were a myth. But despite the backbreaking labor and constant mud, peasants kept society going. Without them, no one ate, including the king. So next time you bite into a loaf of bread, raise an imaginary flagon to the folks who earned it the muddy way. In medieval villages, life followed the rhythm of the seasons and the occasional strange superstition. Spring meant planting, summer meant sweating, autumn meant harvesting, and winter meant praying the food lasted. But it wasn't all mud and turnips. Villagers knew how to party. There were festivals for planting, festivals for harvest, festivals for saints, and sometimes festivals just because someone had a good dream. People wore flower crowns, danced around maypoles, and occasionally blamed goats for bad weather. Superstitions were everywhere. Sneezing twice near a well might curse your wheat, and dropping a spoon could mean someone would get married or die, it was unclear. Between work and weird omens, life in the village was never boring. In the feudal world, women's roles were often seen as quiet and obedient, but reality had more layers than a knight's onion soup. Noble ladies managed estates while their husbands played war. Peasant women ran households and farms, and some widows became surprisingly powerful landowners. While society expected them to sew, smile, and stay silent, many women quietly pulled strings behind the scenes. A whispered word to the right priest, a clever marriage arrangement, or simply surviving 6 childbirths earned them more influence than most lords dared to admit. Yes, there were restrictions, but also resilience. In short, not all medieval ladies waited in towers. Some ran the castle, from the shadows. In medieval times, marriage was less about romance and more about land. Noble families treated weddings like chess matches, moving daughters and dowries to secure power, land, or even peace treaties. A bride could bring a castle, a herd of cows, or a suspiciously valuable goose into the union. Parents negotiated alliances over wine, while the couple-to-be exchanged awkward glances across the hall. Sometimes the bride and groom only met on the wedding day. Surprise! And let's not forget the dowry dance. Too small, and your daughter becomes a nun. Too big, and your son-in-law might become ambitious. Marriage was serious business, but occasionally, just occasionally, love did sneak in, usually after the paperwork. In the Middle Ages, childhood was more of a speed run to adulthood. If you were lucky enough to be a noble child, you'd be shipped off at age 7 to be a page, basically a mix of servant and knight in training. Education? Sure, if you count sword polishing and reciting Latin under pressure. For peasant kids, life was simpler. You woke up, fed chickens, helped plow the fields, and occasionally dodged mud pies from your siblings. School? Only if your village had a monk with too much free time. Most children learned the alphabet through church murals or by memorizing the names of saints and hoping one of them protected them from chores. Despite the harshness, there was laughter, games, and a surprising amount of mischief, because even in the Dark Ages, kids were still kids. While lords and ladies enjoyed feasts and politics, behind every noble smirk was a small army of people who made life run, the invisible class. These were the servants, maids, stable boys, cooks, and even the guy whose sole job was to carry the lord's chair. Some worked in castles, sweeping floors and dodging angry nobles. Others worked in kitchens, mastering the art of cooking with limited ingredients and unlimited expectations. There were washerwomen with permanently wrinkled hands and footmen who knew everyone's secrets but couldn't say a word. Their names rarely made it into history books, but without them, even the fanciest banquet would collapse faster than a soggy pie crust. These silent gears of the medieval machine lived in the background, but were absolutely essential. Medieval life wasn't all about plowing fields and dodging arrows. Sometimes people actually had fun. Weddings were grand village affairs, featuring more food than usual, which wasn't saying much. Awkward dancing and drunk uncles falling into haystacks. Funerals, though somber, were also community events, often doubling as gossip gatherings with a side of mourning. But the real showstoppers were the festivals, colorful, chaotic, and vaguely dangerous. Picture a guy on stilts juggling geese, children running in potato sack races, and a local priest trying to bless a pig dressed as a bishop. These events gave medieval folks a rare break from hard labor and gave us moderns a deep appreciation for safety regulations. In the medieval world, protection wasn't free. It came with strings, taxes, and the occasional friendly sword pointed at your barn. Welcome to the system of feudal dues and vassal obligations, where peasants paid for security by handing over grain, chickens, or that one fat goose they were saving for a holiday. The local lord would promise to protect the village from raiders, dragons, or bad weather, though none of these promises came with guarantees or refunds. In exchange, the villagers got a muddy road, a watchtower made of sticks, and a scroll declaring loyalty sealed with wax and indifference. Yet oddly enough, it worked. The system kept rolling, mostly because no one wanted to be the first to stop pushing the cart, literally and figuratively. In medieval feudal society, loyalty came with contracts, verbal ones sealed by handshakes, ale mugs, and occasional sword waving. Lords and vassals were locked in a mutually suspicious embrace. The lord granted land, a fief, and expected loyalty, taxes, and troops in return. The vassal, in turn, expected not to be abandoned in battle or charged surprise fees during harvest. This delicate dance was called fealty, but it often looked like two actors reading different scripts. Loyalty oaths were taken so seriously that breaking them could lead to being labeled a traitor, or worse, being ignored at feasts. Still, the system sort of worked, until someone forgot to bring the ale, and then it got political. Because in the end, nothing says eternal loyalty quite like a sheep farm and vague threats from a guy in a feathered hat. In the heart of every medieval town stood the church, sometimes taller than any lord's ego, with soaring towers, stained glass windows, and bells loud enough to wake the laziest peasant. The church was more than just a place to pray. It was the community's spiritual HQ, political news hub, and unofficial rumor mill. Want to know who's marrying whom or who owes taxes? Just stand near the confession booth. The local priest was both moral guide and low-key gossip king. And the grandeur of the church itself? A not-so-subtle reminder that while kings ruled on earth, God and his architects ruled the skyline. Whether you were a devout believer or just there for the free bread after Mass, the church loomed large, physically and metaphorically. If the church were a corporation, the Pope would be the CEO, complete with a golden throne instead of a swivel chair. Beneath him, layers of spiritual management, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and priests, each with a fancy title and slightly less fancy robe. At the base, the humble parishioner who funds the whole hierarchy via tithes, aka spiritual taxes. The structure was both impressive and confusing, like a heavenly bureaucracy where blessings trickled down and guilt flowed up. Each level had its own duties, powers, and secret rivalries. Ever seen a bishop side-eye an archbishop over who gets the bigger altar at Easter Mass? Trust us, medieval church politics were spicier than court dramas. And despite the holy titles, every layer came with its own blend of piety, power, and people management headaches. Bishops, monks, and nuns each had their own spiritual job description, though none included sense of humor. Bishops wore elaborate hats and carried golden staffs, often acting more like regional managers than humble servants of God. Monks, on the other hand, were the quiet librarians of the faith, copying manuscripts by hand and trying not to spill ink on holy texts. Some were so dedicated they barely spoke a word for years. And then there were the nuns, firm, disciplined, and often the only ones who could keep an entire convent running while schooling children and feeding the poor. While these roles seem noble, and they were, let's not pretend they didn't come with a fair share of internal drama. Who sang off, key, in morning prayers? Who borrowed parchment without asking? Or who snuck an extra boiled egg at supper? Even in sacred robes, human quirks remained alive and well. The Benedictine monastery wasn't just a spiritual retreat. It was the Ivy League of the medieval world. Founded by Saint Benedict, these monasteries housed monks who were as devoted to books as they were to God. While the outside world swung swords, the Benedictines wielded quills. They copied manuscripts meticulously, sometimes spending weeks on a single page, and cursing quietly if a drop of ink landed wrong. Their libraries were treasure troves of classical knowledge, tucked between sacred chants and mealtime prayers. Education here meant Latin grammar, Gregorian chants, and a lot of sitting still, something few novices mastered without a few smacks on the back of the head. Despite the silence, drama still brewed, quill theft, debates over punctuation, and accusations of snoring during prayer. Still, the Benedictines preserved a wealth of knowledge that would later fuel the Renaissance, though they never got credit on the book covers. In the Age of Faith, The Inquisition courts were the medieval version of courtroom drama, minus the lawyers, fairness, and any hope of appeal. Accused of heresy? Congrats. Your neighbor probably didn't like your stew and told the bishop. Trials could start with whispers and end with bonfires. The inquisitors, often robed men with tired eyes and zero humor, would interrogate with a mix of scripture and suspicion. Confessions were encouraged, sometimes with persuasive tools like racks, thumbscrews, or just the threat of eternal damnation. Defendants were often confused, terrified, or accidentally sarcastic, which didn't help. The audience? A mix of villagers eating turnips and mumbling prayers, unsure if they were next. While the church claimed it was about saving souls, the process looked suspiciously like medieval horror theater. The real miracle? Some people survived it with nothing more than a shaved head and an awkward apology scroll. During the late Middle Ages, Europe went on a massive witch hunt. Literally. Villagers were suddenly suspicious of anyone who owned a black cat, brewed herbal tea, or simply looked too confident on a full moon night. Witchcraft accusations spread like wildfire, fueled by fear, superstition, and perhaps a little neighborhood jealousy. Trials were less about evidence and more about bizarre tests, like being thrown into a lake to see if you floated, which somehow proved guilt. Even sneezing at the wrong time could land someone in trouble. Ironically, many accused witches were elderly women who knew too much about plants. The church often got involved, seeing this as a moral crusade, but things quickly turned into absurd community theater. Bonfires were lit, crowds gathered, and somewhere between the torches and pitchforks, the line between justice and panic vanished. The only real magic? How these events became one of history's darkest jokes. The Crusades. Nothing says peace and love like sailing halfway across the world to fight people you've never met. Starting in the 11th century, thousands of Europeans, stirred by fiery sermons and promises of eternal salvation, and maybe some land and treasure, marched to the Holy Land. What began as a holy mission quickly turned into a chaotic mix of miscommunication, sunburns, and culture shock. Knights in armor clanked their way across unfamiliar deserts, occasionally arguing over who gets the last piece of stale bread. Some didn't even make it past the Mediterranean, and while many expected swift victories, they often encountered fierce resistance and questionable directions. The results? A long series of wars that left behind a tangled legacy of politics, trade, and trauma. But hey, at least someone brought back spices and new recipes for stew. Because when you mix religion and swords, history always remembers, awkwardly. In medieval Europe, the Bible wasn't just a religious text. It was the ultimate bestseller. Too bad it was only available in Latin, which 99% of the population couldn't read. For commoners, scripture was more like a mysterious spell book, guarded by priests who translated it into scary sermons or dramatic stained glass windows. Meanwhile, nobles and clergy used the Bible not only for spiritual guidance, but also to justify pretty much anything, from war to taxes to why you shouldn't eat bacon on a Tuesday. It shaped everything from bedtime stories to political policies. Want to challenge authority? Sorry, the Bible says no, somewhere probably. People didn't read it as much as they were told what it said, often with a finger wagging dramatically. In a world where literacy was rarer than a bath, the Bible's influence was absolute, even when misunderstood. And let's be honest, nothing says divine wisdom like, "Thou shalt listen to me because I read Latin." In medieval Catholic life, rituals weren't optional. They were the spiritual equivalent of daily hygiene, though sadly taken more seriously than actual hygiene. From birth to death, everyone passed through an assembly line of holy ceremonies. Baptism? Check. Confession? Weekly dose of guilt? Communion? A mysterious bread and wine combo served with solemn stares. And let's not forget last rites, which had a tendency to show up earlier than expected if the priest walked too fast. These rituals served as checkpoints on the heavenly highway, with priests acting like divine customs officers. Stamp here, sprinkle there, chant something in Latin. Most peasants didn't understand the words, but hey, As long as you got splashed with water and didn't sneeze mid-blessing, you were good. These ceremonies added structure to lives that were otherwise chaotic, cold, and crop-dependent. In short, medieval rituals were like spiritual user manuals, just written in a language nobody could read, with instructions you couldn't question. In medieval Europe, when the Pope sneezed in Rome, a king in France caught a cold. That's how delicate the balance of power was. Popes claimed divine authority over earthly rulers, while kings insisted their crowns were shiny enough to resist holy interference. The result? A series of dramatic, ego-filled spats worthy of any modern soap opera. One moment they were exchanging letters soaked in passive aggression and holy threats. The next, excommunications were flying like medieval emails. Some kings tried to appoint their own bishops, prompting popes to shout, "That's my job," though in Latin and with more incense. Meanwhile, peasants watched confused. Wait, are we at war with the Pope now, or just mildly disappointed in him? This tug of war between church and crown would define centuries of politics, complete with dramatic walkouts, papal timeouts, and one emperor who stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days to apologize. Yes, even monarchs had to queue for forgiveness. Divine power politics, medieval style. When words failed, medieval people turned to brushes, chisel, and chants. Faith wasn't just preached, it was painted, carved, and sung. Churches became art museums before museums were a thing. Frescoes on walls showed saints with perfect halos and suspiciously modern jawlines. Sculptors went wild. Gargoyles stuck tongues out at sinners, while angels posed with better posture than most nobles. Inside, stained glass windows turned sunlight into holy disco lights. And if that wasn't enough, there was the music. Gregorian chants echoed through stone halls, the monks harmonizing so well that even birds paused to listen. Art wasn't just decoration, it was divine messaging. Every brushstroke shouted, "Believe harder." Yet not everyone appreciated it equally. Peasants stared at murals during Mass, mostly because it beat looking at the priest's beard. But for all its grandeur, sacred art gave color to a gray, muddy world and helped keep people dreaming of something higher, preferably with golden edges and floating cherubs. In the medieval age, land was the ultimate prize. Lords, dukes, and barons all wanted more. More fields, more rivers, more sheep to argue over. Thus began the endless feudal wars. One lord might wake up, sip his mead, and declare, "That hill over there looks like mine now," and off to war they went. These were not grand, noble battles, but often chaotic skirmishes where half the army didn't show up because it rained. Feudal knights clanked in armor, squires lost the horses, and peasants were conscripted with pitchforks and terrible attitudes. Castles changed hands faster than gossip in a tavern. Alliances were made and broken faster than a monk could say, "Amen." And all the while, the common folk just wanted to harvest their wheat without being trampled. These land-grab conflicts shaped borders and rivalries for centuries. But let's not pretend they were glamorous. Picture noblemen arguing like toddlers over who gets which side of the moat. Spoiler, nobody wins when your prize pig is stolen in a raid. Building a medieval army was less about strategy and more about creative recruitment. Lords needed soldiers, so they'd call upon their peasants, shout loudly in the marketplace, or promise vague honor and glory, which usually meant mud and back pain. Recruits came in all shapes, farmers wielding pitchforks, blacksmiths with oversized hammers, and one guy who thought shouting very loudly was a weapon. Training? That was more like a chaotic boot camp. Drill sergeants screamed, archers missed targets entirely, and knights tried to mount horses with all the elegance of a sack of potatoes. Wooden swords broke mid-swing, and armor fittings led to more bruises than protection. Yet somehow, after weeks of yelling, sweating, and accidentally whacking each other, they resembled a passable army, at least from a distance. The true miracle wasn't the training, it was that anyone came back for a second campaign. Medieval weapons were as creative as they were terrifying. You had bows for distance, swords for honor, axes for intimidation, and crossbows for people who didn't have time to aim. But the real showstoppers were siege weapons. Enter the trebuchet, essentially a giant medieval catapult that flung rocks, flaming barrels, or sometimes even rotting cow carcasses. Talk about psychological warfare. Watching one in action was like seeing a giant medieval baseball pitcher on a bad day. Soldiers would cheer, engineers would panic over rope tension, and one guy always ran the wrong way when it launched. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, someone always had a weapon far too big for them, swinging it with the grace of a drunk goat. War wasn't just brutal, it was unintentionally hilarious at times. Because when your best hope lies in a wooden contraption that groans louder than the enemy, all you can do is pray and duck. In medieval times, castles were less like fairy tale mansions and more like oversized stone bunkers with mood swings. They were built not for comfort, but to keep invaders out, and sometimes to keep annoying relatives in. With thick walls, narrow windows, perfect for shooting arrows, not for sunlight, and moats filled with questionable liquids, castles were the Swiss Army knives of defense. Inside, you had spiral staircases designed to confuse right-handed attackers and drawbridges that creaked dramatically, because nothing says intimidation like a creaky entrance. Lords would proudly show off their towers while conveniently ignoring the freezing draft and lack of plumbing. Defending a castle was all about patience, planning, and hoping the enemy didn't bring a bigger trebuchet. For all their might, castles were also social hubs, complete with gossip, banquets, and the occasional bat in the pantry. In short, if you weren't at war, you were probably waiting for one to start. Siege warfare in the Middle Ages was basically a very slow, very uncomfortable waiting game, with a sprinkle of flying boulders and flaming barrels. Armies camped outside castle walls for weeks or months, hoping the people inside would run out of food or patience. Tunnels were dug, ladders built, and wooden siege towers wheeled up, though half the time they caught fire before reaching the walls. The defending side, meanwhile, poured boiling oil, threw rocks, and if they were feeling especially dramatic, launched cow carcasses with catapults. One unfortunate soldier once got hit by flying cheese. Seriously, morale was tested daily. Soldiers got bored, archers ran out of arrows, and everyone smelled like socks left in a swamp. In the end, either the gates cracked, someone got bribed, or everyone agreed it was just too rainy to fight. Medieval sieges, less glory, more trench foot. The 100 Years' War between England and France was, ironically, more than 100 years of on-again, off-again drama. It started over a royal family feud, basically who had the fanciest hat, and escalated into a continental breakup. Kings changed, alliances flipped like pancakes, and peasants were drafted whether they had shoes or not. Famous names like Joan of Arc showed up, swinging inspiration and a sword. Battles ranged from legendary, Agincourt, to wait, what were we fighting for again? Armies marched, retreated, camped, and occasionally forgot what side they were on. By the time it ended, both kingdoms were exhausted, broke, and still arguing over who technically won. If medieval Europe had social media, this war would have been the longest, messiest thread imaginable. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 was not just a clash of swords, it was a full-blown historical plot twist. On one side, Harold Godwinson, crowned King of England and fresh from another battle. On the other, William, Duke of Normandy, with a beefy claim to the throne and a boatload of angry Normans. The battlefield turned into a medieval chaos fest. Archers launching volleys, infantry pushing like a rugby scrum, and cavalry charging dramatically through clouds of dust. Harold's army held strong until a legendary arrow, supposedly, found his eye. Q gasps. William won, became king, and brought a whole new culture and better cheese to England. If this were a TV episode, it would have ended on a cliffhanger and a dramatic narrator saying, "Everything changed after Hastings." In medieval warfare, cavalry was the flashy superstar, charging with lances, trampling everything, and looking fabulous while doing it. Knights in polished armor thundered across the battlefield like heavily armored peacocks, all in the name of honor, or at least a paycheck. But not all warriors were born noble. Enter the mercenaries. These freelance fighters didn't care much for glory. They just wanted gold, food, and maybe a decent pair of boots. From crossbowmen for hire to rogue pikemen switching sides mid-battle, mercenaries were the medieval version of gig workers, minus the app. Lords hired them when things got serious or when their nephews failed sword training. They were brave, ruthless, and occasionally complained about food quality. Together, cavalry and mercenaries turned every battlefield into a dramatic, chaotic, and occasionally hilarious mess. For commoners in medieval war zones, life was basically a long-running survival game with no pause button. One day you're baking bread, the next day your bakery is a watchtower. Families had escape plans like squirrels, hiding in cellars or haystacks at the first sound of marching boots. Chickens fled faster than knights. Children learned early to distinguish between friendly trumpet and incoming invasion. Daily routines included milking the cow, patching the roof, and keeping an eye on smoke signals from the neighboring village. When soldiers passed through, you offered food, smiled nervously, and prayed they'd leave your goat alone. It was a chaotic mix of fear, dark humor, and improvisation. Peasants became masters of dodging arrows and awkward small talk with armed strangers. When the battles ended, if they ever really did, what remained was a mess only Mother Nature and some very confused peasants could attempt to fix. Fields were scorched, livestock vanished, or mysteriously rebranded in other villages, and anyone who sneezed became a potential plague suspect. Water wells were either poisoned or turned into frog spas. Hunger was rampant. Soup recipes included bark, old boots, and the occasional unlucky rat. Local healers prescribed wine for fever and leeches for everything else. Churches held nonstop masses for peace, while nobles squabbled over who technically won. In truth, nobody really won. Everyone just looked around at the rubble, shrugged, and began rebuilding, again, while muttering, "Maybe this time it'll last, at least till the next war." After centuries of mud, war, and sheep, something remarkable happened. People started gathering in one place and decided not to leave. Thus, the medieval town was born. These towns weren't exactly clean or quiet, but they were bustling with ambition and fleas. Merchants set up shop, artisans hammered away, and someone always seemed to be yelling about turnips. Wooden buildings leaned dangerously, streets were so narrow 2 donkeys couldn't pass without awkward eye contact, and the town square was a chaotic symphony of gossip, chickens, and suspiciously overenthusiastic bards. While nobles scoffed at the noise, peasants dreamed of escaping the mud for a chance to become slightly cleaner mud dwellers with a booth. It was messy, noisy, but undeniably the start of urban Europe. In the heart of every booming medieval town, there was one group you didn't want to mess with: the guilds. These weren't secret societies with weird handshakes. Well, not always. But organized groups of artisans and merchants who controlled everything from shoe sizes to sausage quality. Want to sell bread? Better join the Baker's Guild and pass the Great Loaf Inspection. Want to make barrels? The Cooper's Guild had a 3-year apprenticeship and an exam that included balancing a barrel on your head. These guilds set prices, trained apprentices, and made sure no one dared to undercut them. Meetings were held in candlelit halls filled with scrolls, arguing men, and a surprising amount of cheese. While they could seem a bit strict, guilds actually brought order to the chaotic world of medieval commerce and gave people a real sense of pride. Plus, let's be honest, nothing says power like a guy in an apron with a custom seal stamp. Medieval fairs weren't just about trade. They were the Super Bowl, music festival, and shopping mall of the Middle Ages all rolled into one. Held once or twice a year, these events transformed sleepy towns into buzzing centers of color, chaos, and commerce. Traders came from across the continent, dragging wagons loaded with spices, wool, exotic fabrics, and mysterious jars labeled "Do Not Sniff." Farmers tried to sell potatoes that looked suspiciously like rocks, while performers juggled flaming sticks next to stalls selling questionable cheese. Kids chased chickens through the crowds, nobles haggled for silk, and someone always lost a boot in the mud. These fairs weren't just fun, they were crucial to the economy, linking rural and urban life in a way no TikTok trend ever could. And if you were lucky, you might even get a free sample of dried herring, if you didn't mind the smell. Long before modern banks and ATMs, medieval Europeans had to get creative with their money. Coins were the currency of choice, but there were dozens of types, each from a different region, and no one ever had exact change. Imagine trying to buy bread with a Flemish groat in a French village. Good luck. As trade expanded, merchants began using letters of credit and promissory notes, which were essentially the medieval version of "I owe you one." This helped avoid carrying sacks of jingling coins across dangerous roads filled with bandits and suspicious goats. Enter the moneylenders, often sitting behind wooden counters in the marketplace, surrounded by abacuses, ledgers, and customers nervously counting coins. Some even charged interest, gasp, causing the clergy to frown deeply. It was messy, unpredictable, and occasionally hilarious. But this early financial chaos laid the groundwork for modern banking and future overdraft fees. In medieval Europe, where Christians were discouraged from charging interest, guess who stepped in to fill the financial gap? Jewish communities, often barred from landowning or guild jobs, became essential players in trade and finance. Lending money wasn't exactly a popular profession. It came with risks, like angry nobles who conveniently forgot to repay loans. Still, many Jewish families became skilled financiers, traveling merchants, and brokers of long-distance trade. They developed impressive networks, fluent in several languages and currencies. But success also brought resentment. Whenever a ruler needed quick cash or someone to blame during a crisis, Jewish communities became convenient scapegoats. Anti-Semitic laws, forced relocations, and periodic violence cast a dark shadow over their contributions. Despite it all, they helped lay the early framework for Europe's growing economy, though their role was often left out of the official history books. Because, why give credit when you can just take the credit? Before Amazon Prime and next-day shipping, medieval Europe had salt, wool, and iron. These were the rock stars of commerce, minus the groupies and pyrotechnics. Salt wasn't just for seasoning bland stew, it was essential for preserving food. Entire towns thrived off salt production, while caravans and ships carried this white gold across the continent. Wool? That was the backbone of English wealth. If you were a sheep in 14th century England, life was short but economically impactful. And then there was iron, used for everything from plows to weapons to poorly made door hinges. These staple goods formed the backbone of medieval trade, crisscrossing the continent in ox carts, riverboats, and suspiciously loud merchant wagons. Markets bustled, deals were struck, and someone always tried to pass off goat hair as premium wool. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept cities running, blacksmiths working, and peasants sweating. Forget diamonds. Back then, the real treasure came in burlap sacks and smelled faintly of barnyard. Move over, knights and nobles. The new social climbers of medieval Europe were the town dwellers, or as history calls them, the bourgeoisie. These folks weren't born into castles, but they were making coin faster than you could say feudalism. Dressed in decent wool instead of tattered rags, they owned shops, brewed beer, crafted shoes, and even lent money, with a suspiciously high processing fee. They weren't exactly royalty, but they had something just as powerful: receipts. Their children learned to read, their wives ran businesses, and their dinner conversations involved taxes rather than sword fighting. While peasants toiled and nobles jousted, the townfolk quietly built influence one coin at a time. Of course, not everyone liked their rise. Some nobles scoffed, pfft, merchants, but then secretly ordered furniture from them. Slowly, these market-savvy townspeople became the backbone of urban life and the middle-class prototype. They proved you didn't need a title to make history, just a good ledger and decent shoes. If you think medieval cities were just a mess of winding alleys and randomly placed wells, think again. There was some method to the madness. As towns boomed, people realized that having the butcher next to the tanner, read smell factory, was probably a bad idea. Slowly but surely, urban planning emerged. Markets were placed near the center, streets widened to fit carts and the occasional parade, and even sewer systems were, well, attempted. Buildings became multi-storied, with upper floors jutting out as if trying to high-five each other across the street. Planners, often local officials or guild elders, drew city maps that looked more like treasure hunts. But hey, it worked. The wealthier the town, the fancier the layout, with stone roads, fountains, and watchtowers to impress visitors and intimidate robbers. Sure, it wasn't exactly Paris, but for the time, it was downright progressive. And the locals? They finally stopped getting lost on the way to buy bread. As medieval towns grew busier, so did their rule books. You couldn't just throw your chamber pot out the window anymore, at least not without yelling a warning first. City councils began enforcing laws to keep the peace, or at least try. Curfews were set, street fights were banned, unless it was market day, and public drunkenness might earn you a good dunking in the town's cold fountain. Guards patrolled the streets, wearing uniforms that made them look like walking soup pots, while town criers shouted new decrees nobody really listened to. Citizens were expected to report crimes, though most preferred pretending not to see. Despite the chaos, these rules were the baby steps toward modern civic order. And while enforcement was more enthusiastic than effective, it gave people a sense of structure and something to grumble about. Because what's more medieval than grumbling about taxes, curfews, and the guy next door who keeps accidentally dumping waste into your yard? While most of medieval Europe was still under the thumb of kings and lords, a few rebellious cities decided they'd had enough. Thus were born the independent city-states, tiny republics run not by crowns, but by councils of wealthy merchants and smug artisans with impressive beards. These places experimented with early forms of democracy, votes, assemblies, and shouting matches in public squares. Sure, the system wasn't perfect. Votes could be bought with barrels of wine, and every decision took 3 debates and a dramatic storming out. But it was a start. Citizens took great pride in governing themselves, even if most couldn't agree on what to do once they had the power. Still, it was a bold shift. Power no longer came just from bloodlines or swords, but from coin purses and collective complaints. The seeds of modern democracy? Perhaps. Or just an excuse to argue over who should fix the potholes in front of the fish market. In the early Middle Ages, if you wanted an education, you didn't go to a school with colorful classrooms and recess. You went straight to the church. The first schools were tucked inside monasteries, run by monks who took education and silence very seriously. Students, often young boys from noble families, sat on hard benches for hours, copying Latin texts they barely understood. Asking questions was risky. Brother Gregor might just assign you extra penance, or worse, extra grammar. The curriculum? Latin, Latin, and more Latin. Arithmetic, if you were lucky. Despite the stern atmosphere, these monastic schools laid the foundation for Europe's future universities. Sure, they smelled of old parchment and boiled cabbage, but they preserved knowledge through centuries of chaos. Without them, we might not have Shakespeare, or long essays about why a tree symbolizes divine wisdom. In an age before printing presses and Wikipedia, knowledge had to be copied by hand. Enter the medieval clerics, part priest, part historian, part copy machine. These patient and often nearsighted men spent their lives bent over desks in scriptoriums, transcribing text one painstaking word at a time. Ink stains were a badge of honor, and smudging a page might lead to a very stern prayer session. They didn't just copy religious texts. They also preserved ancient Greek philosophy, Roman law, and even the odd cookbook, because who doesn't want to know how to stew a 12th century turnip? With quills in hand and backs permanently hunched, they were the unsung heroes of literacy. Sure, their work lacked emojis and hyperlinks, but thanks to them, the past didn't get entirely erased by the Dark Ages. Before pop stars and autotune, medieval Europe had its own musical sensation, Gregorian chant. These sacred songs echoed through stone cathedrals, performed by monks with voices smoother than butter, or at least smoother than medieval cheese. There were no instruments, just pure vocal harmony, carefully arranged in Latin and sung with such solemnity that even the birds outside went quiet. It wasn't all heavenly, though. Practice sessions often involved off-key monks, sneezes mid-note, and stern glances from choir masters. Yet these chants served not only as worship, but as a way to unify communities and pass on rhythm and order in a world full of chaos. And if you think monks didn't have flair, think again. Some of their hymnals were so beautifully illustrated, they'd give modern album covers a run for their money. Before Netflix and Shakespeare, there was religious theater. In medieval Europe, monks and local townsfolk staged morality plays right in church courtyards or village squares. The plots? Timeless tales of virtue, sin, and divine punishment with just a sprinkle of slapstick. Picture a devil actor tripping over his tail or an angel forgetting his lines mid-speech. These plays were dramatic, sure, but also wildly popular. They turned Bible stories into accessible blockbusters, complete with cardboard halos and wooden swords. The audience? A mix of curious peasants, bored teenagers, and merchants taking a lunch break. While the plays had a pious goal, to teach Christian values, they often included comical bits to keep the crowd awake and keep the sinners guessing. Religious theater may not have had CGI, but it had something better. A jolly monk with stage fright and a sheep that wandered into Act 2. Medieval literature wasn't all doom, gloom, and Gregorian chants. Meet the literary all-stars, Dante and Chaucer. Dante Alighieri, an Italian with a flair for the dramatic, wrote The Divine Comedy, a poetic journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven. It's basically a medieval road trip with bonus fire and brimstone. Meanwhile, Geoffrey Chaucer, an English civil servant with a cheeky sense of humor, gave us the Canterbury Tales, where pilgrims swap stories that range from holy to hilariously inappropriate. These authors brought humor, critique, and imagination to the Dark Ages, proving that people back then had more than just plagues and pitchforks. They had wit. Though writing was done by hand and editing meant scratching out with a knife, their words still echoed through monasteries, taverns, and eventually the classroom. So next time you're stuck reading old verse, remember, even in a time without electricity, these guys were lighting up minds. In the Middle Ages, science was a curious cocktail of logic, observation, and, well, a whole lot of guesswork. Scholars debated if mice spontaneously appeared from haystacks or if sneezing could summon demons. Astronomy and alchemy shared the same lab, with bearded monks studying star charts next to bubbling flasks of questionable green liquid. To be fair, some thinkers made real progress, experimenting with herbs, studying anatomy, and even theorizing about gravity. But these sparks of insight often bumped heads with good old-fashioned superstition. If someone sneezed too loudly in the library, time for a prayer session and a sprinkle of holy water. Despite this, the thirst for knowledge persisted. Medieval science wasn't perfect, but hey, for a time when most thought the Earth was the universe's VIP lounge, even wondering what made the stars shine was a huge leap. Before the age of printing presses, every book was a masterpiece, mainly because it took months or years to make one. Monks and scribes hunched over desks, their noses nearly touching the parchment, as they carefully copied every letter by hand. A sneeze could smudge an entire page. A spilled ink pot? A biblical tragedy. Some even decorated the margins with tiny doodles of dragons, rabbits, or people fighting snails. Yes, seriously. These illuminated manuscripts weren't just books. They were treasures. Libraries were guarded like fortresses, and owning a book was like having your own private spaceship today. As rare and expensive as they were, these handwritten tomes preserved knowledge through the ages, all thanks to a small army of sleepy-eyed scribes with chronic back pain and impeccable penmanship. In the 15th century, something magical and slightly mechanical happened. Johannes Gutenberg introduced the printing press. Suddenly, books weren't confined to dusty monasteries or reserved for nobles who could afford a scribe's lifetime wages. No, now even a slightly literate merchant or a curious baker's apprentice could own a book. Sometimes two. Gutenberg's invention kicked off what was basically the Middle Ages version of going viral. Ideas spread fast, from theological debates to spicy romance tales. Monks, once the sole guardians of written knowledge, were caught mumbling, "Back in my day, we had to draw every letter uphill both ways." The printing press didn't just mass-produce books. It democratized knowledge, annoyed traditionalists, and gave birth to an entirely new era of learning, complete with typos and paper cuts. Before bedtime TikToks and fantasy Netflix series, medieval folks had their own form of binge-worthy content: legends, folk tales, and epic hero sagas. Around the hearth, storytellers spun wild tales of dragons, talking animals, cursed forests, and brave knights who probably had hygiene issues. These stories weren't just for fun. They taught morals, explained the world, kind of, and scared kids into behaving. The line between history and fiction was often conveniently blurry. Was there really a knight who slayed 10 trolls with a spoon? Depends who you ask. But in a world where literacy was rare and boredom was dangerous, tales passed down by word of mouth were like the social media of their time: viral, exaggerated, and often suspiciously heroic. In medieval villages, science often took a back seat to dreams. Saw a black cat cross the road? Bad luck for 7 years. Dreamt of teeth falling out? Someone's about to die. A rainbow over the church? Clearly, the saints are doing PR. With no access to TikTok therapists or weather apps, people turn to signs from nature, strange dreams, or even the way a chicken walked to determine their fate. Local wise women, or dream interpreters, were the medieval influencers, whispering profound-sounding things like, "The mole on your left foot means your crops will rot." People clung to superstition, not out of ignorance, but because, well, it made life feel less chaotic. When plagues, famines, and bandits were regular guests, a good omen, even if it was just a chicken dancing funny, was a welcome distraction. In a time when taxes were high, food was bland, and bathing was a monthly maybe, the medieval costume festival was a true miracle. For one glorious day, villagers threw off their itchy wool tunics and dressed as saints, devils, knights, or even chickens. It was chaos, but joyful chaos. The baker became the bishop, the town drunk claimed he was a noble, and nobody questioned him because he had feathers. And even the grumpy blacksmith wore a halo made from horseshoes. Laughter echoed through the streets as silly plays were performed, bad jokes were tolerated, and even the priest tried juggling apples, poorly. For a brief, sparkly moment, everyone forgot the plague, the mud, and the smell of cabbage stew. It was escapism at its finest. No internet, no memes, just pure, ridiculous fun. The Black Death didn't knock. It barged in, set the medieval world on fire, and refused to leave for years. Rats with a sinister glint in their eyes, fleas hitching rides like uninvited guests, and sneezes more terrifying than swords. Villages were emptied, streets were silent, and even the bravest knights suddenly believed in garlic necklaces and holy water showers. Panic spread faster than the plague itself. Is it the wrath of God? A bad batch of cheese? People wondered while holding herbs to their noses. Doctors wore creepy bird masks and waved sticks, convinced that poking the air would help. Spoiler, it didn't. But amidst the horror, there were also oddly funny moments, like peasants trying to outrun death by sprinting in full armor. The Black Death was a nightmare dressed in a cloak of absurdity and terror, reshaping Europe with every wheeze and cough. After the Black Death, medieval Europe looked like a poorly managed board game. Entire villages were emptied, and suddenly, peasants found themselves in demand. Landowners, desperate for labor, started offering real wages, warm food, and shockingly, days off. Some serfs even dared to negotiate, leaving lords wide-eyed in disbelief. Meanwhile, towns tried to reset their economies like someone hitting Cottrell Soltondale on a hay-covered marketplace. Guilds scrambled to recruit surviving craftsmen, while nobles muttered bitterly about lazy workers with too much attitude. There was inflation, shortage of goods, and a noticeable increase in townsfolk walking around with an air of, "I survived the plague," swagger. While the upper class grumbled, the common folk got their first taste of economic leverage. It was messy, chaotic, and more than a little funny watching feudal lords forced to sweet-talk villagers who used to clean their stables. Change had come, delivered not by sword or sermon, but by sneeze. Welcome to a medieval hospital, a place where hope goes to catch the flu. Doctors wore long robes and sometimes terrifying bird-like masks, believing bad smells carried disease. Their treatments, bloodletting, leeches, and the occasional herbal fart under the blanket to chase demons away. Beds were shared, bandages reused, and if you didn't get better, at least you'd die surrounded by curiosity. Monks often ran these places, alternating between prayers and applying mysterious pastes to open wounds. Sanitation, optional, diagnosis, mostly guessing. The leech jar was the most trusted tool, followed closely by a stick for poking things and seeing if they screamed. And yet, amidst all the medieval madness, some patients actually survived, either by miracle or because the doctors ran out of leeches. The hospital was a chaotic mix of genuine care, holy intentions, and completely bonkers medical ideas. But hey, at least it smelled like rosemary and fear. As the Black Death swept across Europe, many people thought the world was ending. And honestly, with the smell, the screaming, and the monks chanting 24/7, it did feel a bit apocalyptic. People turned to religion with a new intensity. Some prayed, some fasted, others whipped themselves in public, convinced it would earn them divine mercy. These self-flagellating groups roamed from town to town like dark parades of regret, smacking themselves and yelling about sin. Even folks who had never attended church suddenly remembered all their past sins, including that one time they stole cheese. Merchants sold indulgences like medieval discount coupons for heaven. Some saw visions, others heard voices, and a few just locked themselves in cellars with wine and hope for the best. It was a time of fear, faith, and frankly, a lot of bruises. The end didn't come, but a whole lot of people came to believe that repentance might help, or at least distract them from everything else falling apart. After the plague came another nightmare, famine. Crops failed across Europe due to a lovely combo of erratic weather, exhausted soil, and a serious shortage of farmers, thanks Black Death. The few surviving peasants were either too weak or too busy burying bodies to tend the fields. In villages, people resorted to boiling bark, chewing leather, or even fighting over moldy bread. Monks tried to organize food distributions, but with little success, unless you count their sermons about divine punishment as nourishment. In some towns, cats and rats disappeared mysteriously, possibly into stews. Nobles hoarded grain while pretending they also suffered, sipping wine in castles. People started blaming the stars, witches, or neighbors with suspiciously full pantries. What began as crop failure quickly turned into a social crisis. Theft increased, beggars flooded cities, and rumors spread faster than butter on hot toast, if there had been toast. Medieval hunger wasn't just about empty stomachs. It was about the collapse of trust, community, and for some, dinner. All in all, a rather crunchy chapter in Europe's history, especially when bark was on the menu. After famine and plague came pitchforks and rebellion. Fed up with high taxes, no food, and being treated like walking manure, peasants across Europe began to riot. These weren't your everyday grumpy mobs. No, they were determined, underfed, and very angry, with homemade banners reading things like "bread or bust" and "stop taking our chickens." Armed with hoes, rakes, and the occasional frying pan, they stormed manors and tax offices, which were really just thatched roof sheds. Nobles were horrified, partly because their wine cellars were looted, but mostly because their servants were now leading angry chants. Though most revolts were eventually crushed with sword and sermon, the message was clear. The feudal system had cracks. These peasant uprisings didn't end serfdom overnight, but they did make kings and lords sit up straight and rethink their harvest party plans. Turns out, angry farmers aren't great at planting crops. but they're excellent at storming castles. Medieval Europe had heard its first coordinated "enough is enough," and it came with a hoe, a roar, and probably some very muddy shoes. Just when Europe thought things couldn't get messier, bam! The church entered its own drama phase. For a time, there were not one, not two, but three popes claiming to be the real deal. One in Rome, one in Avignon, and another wild card who set up shop somewhere in between. Each issued bold declarations, excommunications, and of course taxes to fund their robes and fancy hats. Confused Christians didn't know whom to follow. Some villagers even split their churches down the middle like a medieval turf war. Team Rome pews on the left, Team Avignon on the right. The situation got so ridiculous, it felt like the world's slowest and most holy reality show. Who wants to be the real pope? In the end, the mess was so embarrassing that church officials had to host a council, aka crisis meeting with wine, to fire all three and start fresh. But for years, the faith of Europe was like a tug-of-war match, with incense. It was the kind of theological chaos that made peasants scratch their heads and say, maybe we'll just pray at home. Among all the grim aftermaths of the plague and famine, one image stood out the most: abandoned children with big eyes and even bigger questions. Parents had either succumbed to disease, fled in panic, or in some tragic cases, left with a note and a loaf of bread, whispering, "Stay safe, Timmy." Monasteries turned into makeshift orphanages, now filled with loud toddlers asking why the monks don't serve cookies. Some older kids tried to look tough, forming little gangs with wooden swords and dramatic names like the Plague-born. Families were torn apart not just by death, but by survival decisions. Siblings separated, relatives overwhelmed, and entire lineages ended overnight. In the chaos, even nobles weren't spared. Some young lords suddenly found themselves owners of lands, titles, and no clue how taxes worked. It was a silent tragedy woven into the background of every cobblestone street, the echo of missing voices. Yet somehow amidst the gloom, these children built games from sticks, hope from stories, and resilience from sheer stubbornness. Because even when the world crumbled, a child's imagination was too busy building castles from dirt to notice. After plague, famine, and rebellion had taken their toll, Europe slowly emerged like a groggy peasant waking up after a terrible feast. Ruins became construction sites, children once orphaned found adoptive families, and nobles suddenly started pretending to care about hygiene. Sort of. With so many people gone, labor became valuable, and peasants dared to ask, what if we get paid? Some towns introduced basic sanitation. Others just stopped throwing garbage out the window. Progress. The church reorganized, scholars returned to dusty libraries, and even local barons were too tired to wage war every Tuesday. A new order arose, not perfect, not peaceful, but definitely less plaguey. People relearned to laugh, markets reopened, and songs about surviving the big sneeze became all the rage. It wasn't a utopia, but for once, life didn't feel like one big apocalypse rehearsal. The Middle Ages limped onward, bruised but breathing, carrying with them hard-earned lessons and maybe, just maybe, a few bars of soap. In medieval society, being a woman came with one certainty. Everyone had an opinion about your life, except you. Peasant women rose with the sun, worked in the fields, baked, mended, raised children, and somehow still found time to gossip by the well. Their husbands, often busy, napping in the shade. Meanwhile, noble women lived behind thick stone walls, embroidering eternal tapestries while plotting how not to marry a cousin. They might wield influence, but only if their father, husband, or son allowed it or wasn't paying attention. Widows, on the other hand, could run businesses or estates so naturally they were viewed with great suspicion. Some women became midwives, herbalists, or innkeepers, though these professions sometimes came with accusations of witchcraft, depending on how successful they were. In every class, women juggled work, family, and endless rules written by men in long robes. It wasn't easy being a medieval woman, unless you enjoyed spinning, silence, and sainthood. Marriage in medieval Europe was less about love and more about land, alliances, and livestock. For women, it often began with a dowry. The more cows, bed sheets, and candlesticks you brought, the better your value. Fathers negotiated matches like businessmen closing deals, sometimes before the bride could walk. Wedding ceremonies were lavish for nobles and brisk for peasants. A handshake and a priest would do. Once married, a woman's job description expanded overnight. Wife, housekeeper, nurse, cook, and heir producer. Saying no wasn't really in the marital vocabulary. Obedience was praised. Complaints were considered a sign of demonic influence, or worse, being difficult. Some women found ways to bend the rules, but most simply bent their backs to carry the burden. The idea of romance? Only in troubadours' songs, and even then, usually ended in tragedy or the convent. For some medieval women, marriage wasn't the only option. There was always the convent, a place of prayer, discipline, and relative peace, as long as you liked silence, cold hallways, and early mornings. Life as a nun meant no husbands, no screaming children, and no dowry negotiations. But it also meant a life of strict rules, minimal meals, and an endless cycle of chores and chants. While some joined voluntarily to escape marriage or pursue learning, others were simply donated to the convent by families with too many daughters. Yet the convent wasn't all doom and gloom. Nuns copied manuscripts, tended herb gardens, and sometimes even practiced medicine. It was one of the rare places where women could read, write, and hold authority, though always under the watchful eye of the church. For women with sharp minds and no patience for suitors, the convent might have been the closest thing to freedom, assuming you liked Latin and laundry. While knights were out jousting and monks were busy copying manuscripts, women in medieval Europe were holding the economy together. Quietly, of course. From peasants harvesting wheat to noble ladies managing entire estates while their husbands were off at war, women didn't just work. They ran the show. In towns, women brewed beer, spun wool, baked bread, and even owned market stalls. Some widows ran thriving businesses, proving that economic power didn't always come with a beard. But let's not pretend it was easy. Laws often limited their rights, and guilds weren't too eager to let women in. Still, resourceful ladies found ways to bend the rules, passing businesses to sons with a wink or sneaking into workshops as helpers. Behind every bustling medieval town was a group of hard-working women in aprons and soot-streaked cheeks, making sure the bread rose and the bills got paid, even if they rarely got credit for it. Pregnancy and childbirth in medieval Europe? Let's just say it wasn't exactly a fairy tale. For many women, giving birth was a terrifying gamble. Half miracle, half battlefield. There were no epidurals, no sterile rooms, and certainly no prenatal yoga. Instead, midwives armed with herbs, whispered prayers, and decades of gritty experience led the charge. While the men paced nervously outside or pretended not to hear the screams, women gathered around the mother with boiled water, linen cloths, and a lot of crossed fingers. Some births went smoothly, others, not so much. Superstition ruled, amulets were hung, saints invoked, and one unlucky chicken might even be sacrificed if things got too complicated. After a successful delivery, the baby was rushed to be baptized, just in case it didn't stick around long. Despite the odds, medieval women showed extraordinary strength, because in a world where surviving childbirth made you a legend, every mother was basically a superhero in a headscarf. Forget cartoons and playdates. Being a child in medieval Europe was anything but carefree. From the moment you could walk without face planting into a goat, you were expected to help out. 5-year-olds fed chickens, carried firewood, or got their ears pulled by the village priest for mispronouncing Latin prayers. Noble kids didn't fare much better. Sure, they had tutors, but they also had to memorize endless manners and learn sword etiquette before they could even write their own name. Toys, if you were lucky, a carved wooden horse or a rag doll made by grandma. Otherwise, it was throw the rock or chase your own shadow. Illnesses were everywhere, and few children made it past age 10, making surviving your own childhood a true badge of honor. Still, between the chores and the sneezes, medieval kids found ways to laugh, learn, and grow into battle-hardened adults by age 12. Who needs adolescence when your bedtime is sunset and your job is real? In medieval Europe, education was a luxury, and a confusing one at that. If you were the son of a noble, congratulations. You got to sit in a chilly stone room, trying to decipher Latin while a grumpy monk whacked your knuckles with a stick every time you daydreamed. For most peasant kids, education meant learning how not to chop your finger off while using a scythe. Reading, writing, that was reserved for clergy, scribes, and kids with very patient parents. Apprenticeships were the real ticket. By age 10, many kids were shipped off to master blacksmiths, bakers, or weavers, where learning meant burning your hands or accidentally setting something on fire. But hey, at least they got a meal. Whether it was letters or leathers, every child had to grow up fast, and hopefully with all 10 fingers intact. In medieval times, kids didn't have smartphones, tablets, or even proper shoes, but they did have imagination and a lot of dirt. Games ranged from mock sword fights with sticks, which occasionally ended with real bruises, to rolling wooden hoops or playing tag around manure piles. For wealthier children, entertainment included playing with carved wooden dolls or board games made from pebbles and chalk. Of course, nobody called it recreational development. It was mostly just running around until someone cried, bled, or both. Popular group games included Catch the Pig, exactly what it sounds like, and Who Can Climb the Tree Without Falling Off. Survival was part of the fun. Laughter echoed across muddy courtyards, and scraped knees were badges of honor. In short, medieval childhood was dirty, chaotic, and absolutely full of joy, if you didn't break a tooth. In medieval Europe, teaching children about morality and faith wasn't exactly a gentle bedtime chat. Instead, it was a daily routine of stern sermons, cautionary tales about hellfire, and the ever-present threat of eternal damnation if you didn't finish your chores. At home, parents use phrases like, "God is watching you," with the same intensity modern parents say, "Don't touch that." In monasteries and churches, children learned prayers before they could tie their shoes, and the concept of sin was introduced earlier than the alphabet. Confession was encouraged, especially if you stole a chicken leg or blamed the dog for knocking over the candle. Religious festivals were double-edged, equal parts joy and moral instruction. Overall, growing up meant a heavy dose of guilt, awe, and the creeping suspicion that angels were constantly judging your behavior. But hey, it built character, right? In medieval Europe, the church had a very specific idea about women. They were either saints or sinners, mostly sinners. From Eve's little apple incident to every bad hair day since, women were blamed for the moral downfall of mankind. A woman showing her ankle? Scandalous. A woman reading? Suspicious. A woman laughing in public? Clearly a witch. Priests delivered sermons warning men to beware of feminine temptations, which apparently included smiling or existing. Confession booths often heard stories of women who dared to think independently, or worse, forgot to bake bread on Sundays. The ironic twist? Women were expected to be paragons of piety while being viewed as inherently weak and easily tempted. It was a lose-lose situation, wrapped in a robe and tied with guilt. Yet many women found ways to navigate this maze of judgment. Some even used the system to gain spiritual power in convents. Medieval double standards served daily with a side of incense. As the Middle Ages stumbled toward its final act, a curious thing happened. Some people actually started getting rich without owning land or wearing armor. Behold the rise of the medieval middle class. These folks weren't knights or nobles, but merchants, bankers, and skilled artisans who realized gold was just as powerful as a sword, and much shinier. In towns across Europe, shopkeepers with decent math skills started building mansions, tailors wore fancier clothes than the lords they served, and the phrase self-made man began to quietly scribble its first draft. Feudal lords scoffed at these money-chasing commoners, right up until they had to borrow money from them. Suddenly, your baker wasn't just selling bread, he was financing cathedrals. The power dynamics began to shift. Coin clinks started to outshine the clash of swords. It was a new social experiment brewing, one gold coin at a time. After centuries of dusty sermons and fear of hellfire, something unexpected happened. People started reading old books again. But not just any books, Greek and Roman ones. Suddenly, thinkers across Europe became obsessed with togas, columns, and dramatic poses. Ancient philosophers like Plato and Cicero were pulled out of the cobweb-covered shelves and treated like rock stars. Monks who used to copy scripture were now sneaking in quotes from Aristotle. Artists stared lovingly at crumbling statues and said, "We should totally make humans look heroic again." It was as if the Middle Ages woke up from a 1,000-year nap and yelled, "Wait, we used to be cool." This rediscovery didn't come with fireworks, but it did come with a lot of scrolls, debates, and wide-eyed scholars rediscovering the ancient recipe for wisdom, and occasionally wine. Thus began a cultural resurrection, not of zombies, but of marble gods and clever Latin puns. With ancient ideas freshly rediscovered, Renaissance artists looked at blank walls and thought, time to paint something epic. But forget stick figures. These folks went all in. Dramatic lighting, flowing robes, emotional expressions, and lots of halos, so many halos. Early painters like Giotto started adding depth, making saints look less like pancakes and more like people. Sculptors, meanwhile, stared at ancient statues and decided marble needed a comeback. Soon, chisel-wielding artists were making muscles so realistic that people blushed just walking past them. Art workshops turned into talent factories, cranking out altarpieces, portraits, and the occasional overdramatic baby angel. And while patrons smiled proudly beside their commissioned masterpieces, artists whispered, "Finally, someone pays me to paint more than grapes." Thus began a golden age of brushstrokes and stone dust, where beauty, human emotion, and just a tiny bit of vanity ruled the day. During the Renaissance, something radical began to happen. People started asking questions that couldn't be answered with, "Because God said so." Curious minds, armed with telescopes, sketchbooks, and way too much free time, began poking at nature's secrets. Astronomy, anatomy, and physics emerged from the fog of doctrine, blinking in the sunlight of logic. Brave scholars like Copernicus dared to suggest the Earth might not be the center of the universe. Scandalous. Meanwhile, doctors started drawing bodies that looked suspiciously like real humans instead of lumpy potatoes. Of course, this newfound scientific curiosity made some church leaders very nervous. "What's next? Questioning how many angels can dance on a pin," they whispered. But it was too late. The gears of discovery had started turning, and no amount of incense could slow them down. The humanist movement arrived like a gust of fresh air through the dusty halls of medieval thought. No longer was everything about sin, salvation, and staring at stained glass windows. Suddenly, humans were kind of a big deal. Writers and scholars began to dig up old Greek and Roman texts like they were ancient self-help books. Man is the measure of all things, they declared, while sculptors started making statues that actually had muscles again. Philosophers wrote lengthy treatises about dignity, reason, and how it's okay to think for yourself, as long as you still attend Mass on Sundays. Paintings began to feature real people doing real things. No more floating saints everywhere. It was the Renaissance's way of whispering to the world, hey, maybe humans aren't just miserable sinners. Maybe they're also impressive. And just like that, Europe's self-esteem got a much-needed glow-up. While the Renaissance wasn't led by superheroes in tights, it did have its own league of extraordinary gentlemen. Petrarch, for example, was like the original bookworm influencer, collecting ancient manuscripts, writing love poems to an imaginary woman, and declaring, "We really should read more Cicero." Then came Boccaccio, who gave the world the Decameron, a spicy collection of tales that could be described as medieval Netflix, but make it literature. These thinkers didn't just sit around reading scrolls. They questioned authority, admired Roman sandals a bit too much, and wrote so passionately that future historians had to pause and blush. Thanks to them, the world slowly shifted from chanting prayers to pondering ideas like reason, dignity, and maybe hygiene. The Renaissance was underway, Not with fireworks, but with a flourish of the quill and a whisper of, "Have you read this ancient Greek guy?" In the Renaissance, education got a glow-up. No more rote memorization of obscure saints or debating how many angels fit on a pin. Instead, students were suddenly encouraged to think. Radical, right? Schools began to emphasize grammar, rhetoric, logic. Basically, the ancient Roman starter pack for how to sound smart. Wealthy merchant families sent their sons, and occasionally daughters, if dad was feeling extra progressive, to humanist tutors who quoted Cicero more than they breathed. The goal? To create well-rounded, rational individuals, not just devout believers. Of course, some still snuck in a bit of theology, just in case the church peeked in. Meanwhile, apprentices in workshops were getting their own brand of education, learning to mix pigments, measure marble, or avoid setting the workshop on fire. Whether it was Aristotle or anatomy, Latin verbs or chiseling stone, Renaissance education was about expanding the mind and maybe scoring a better paying job than plague remover's assistant. Behind every Renaissance masterpiece was a banker? That's right. While artists painted ceilings and sculpted gods, someone had to foot the bill, and that someone was often a wealthy merchant or banker. Florence, the it city of the Renaissance, was practically sponsored by the Medici family, who ran a bank big enough to make dragons jealous. Art became an investment, a flex, and a way to bribe the afterlife. Want a place in heaven? Commission a Madonna. Need to outshine your business rivals? Build a dome. Even contracts were drawn up with deadlines, down payments, and, gasp, penalty clauses. This unlikely marriage between coin and canvas meant that artists weren't starving anymore. But they were definitely dealing with picky clients who thought they knew everything about anatomy and lighting. In short, money talked, and it said, "Paint me like one of your divine figures, but with more gold and 12% interest." In the quiet corner of a bustling Renaissance workshop, a strange new machine clattered away. The printing press. Thanks to Gutenberg's genius and a lot of squished grapes, well, ink, knowledge no longer needed to be copied by hand in candlelit monasteries while monks grumbled. Suddenly, books went from being luxury items guarded by nobles to surprisingly affordable possessions even a baker could own, after saving up a bit, of course. Pamphlets, almanacs, even spicy political rants could now travel across borders faster than a gossiping nun. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Scribes found themselves out of jobs, and church officials had to deal with peasants quoting Aristotle in the tavern. But the ink flood was unstoppable. Ideas spread like wildfire, sometimes literally. Welcome to the age of mass communication, where hot off the press was both a miracle and a mild fire hazard. At first, the Renaissance was like an exclusive Italian dinner party. Art, philosophy, and wine flowing freely among the elite of Florence, Venice, and Rome. But soon ideas started sneaking out like rebellious teenagers. Across the Alps, France, Germany, the Low Countries, and even England began catching the Renaissance bug. Each region added its own flair. The Germans got philosophical, the Dutch painted with obsessive detail, and the English, well, they gave us Shakespeare. As printing presses multiplied like rabbits, Renaissance thought spread faster than a bard at a gossip convention. Universities revamped their dusty curriculums, artists adopted more perspective, literally and figuratively, and local nobles suddenly fancied themselves patrons of culture, even if they couldn't tell a fresco from a fried egg. The Renaissance had officially gone international, and while the Italians may have started the party, the rest of Europe certainly brought snacks. Even if the Middle Ages were often called dark, their architectural legacy is anything but. Castles with moats, towers, and suspiciously narrow staircases still dot the European countryside like stone dragons guarding history. These medieval homes were a mix of defense and draftiness, perfect for brooding nobles and confused tourists. Then there are the Gothic cathedrals, the skyscrapers of the 12th century, with their flying buttresses and stained glass windows that made everyone feel small, even the king. Don't forget the villages, where cobbled streets, timber-framed houses, and local gossip have barely changed since 1350. Today we marvel at these structures, take thousands of photos, and post them with captions like, "Feeling medieval." While plumbing and heating weren't quite their strong suits, the charm, mystery, and sheer endurance of medieval architecture continue to inspire, remind, and occasionally terrify us, especially when you stay overnight in one. Feudal law might sound like something dusty and outdated, but you'd be surprised how many modern legal systems still carry its fingerprints. In medieval times, laws weren't just written. They were announced loudly in the town square by a man in a funny hat. Justice came in many forms: trials by combat, oaths on relics, and of course, lots of shouting. But out of this glorious chaos came the roots of many things we take for granted: land ownership rights, contracts, court hierarchies, and the idea that laws should apply to everyone except maybe the king's cousin. Today's courts don't involve sword fights, sadly, but they do retain that obsession with documentation, procedure, and arguing politely in front of a robed figure. So next time you get jury duty or read a 50-page contract, you can thank your medieval ancestors and maybe mutter something about feudal efficiency under your breath. Believe it or not, the patchwork of tiny, quarrelsome medieval principalities eventually gave birth to the modern nation-states we know today. Back then, Europe looked like someone spilled a bag of colorful jelly beans on a map, each one ruled by a duke, baron, or an ambitious count with a fancy hat. These miniature kingdoms constantly argued over borders, sheep ownership, and who had the best-looking coat of arms. But over centuries, through marriage alliances, wars, lots of wars, and the occasional sneaky backstab, they began merging. What emerged was the foundation of countries like France, England, and Spain. So yes, your country might have once been a squabbling pile of castles, cows, and confusion, but hey, look at it now, all grown up with passports and national anthems. Deep down, we all owe a tiny thank you to those medieval mapmakers and their wildly ambitious feudal lords. Long before your grammar teacher corrected your emails, medieval folks were busy inventing the roots of modern languages. Though unintentionally, back then, everyone spoke their own version of local gibberish. Villagers from 2 hills apart could barely understand each other, leading to many hilarious market miscommunications. Over time, as people traveled more, often for war, pilgrimage, or just better cheese, dialects began to mix and stabilize. Latin, the ancient scholars' favorite, was slowly blended with local tongues, giving birth to early forms of French, Italian, Spanish, English, and more. So yes, next time your autocorrect changes there to there, blame the monks who tried to Latinify everything. Language, like fashion, evolved out of chaos, except you can't wear conjugation on a runway. Despite all the wars, reforms, and Renaissance dramas, one medieval institution has impressively outlasted kings, empires, and even bad haircuts: the Catholic Church. In the Middle Ages, the church wasn't just a place for Sunday confessions. It was the true power broker, media outlet, and moral police rolled into one. Popes could crown or uncrown emperors, and monasteries had more scribes than a modern publishing house. Fast forward to today, and the church is still standing strong, though less involved in choosing who gets to wear a crown and more into tweeting about forgiveness. Cathedrals remain stunning landmarks, and Latin prayers echo through centuries. Whether you're religious or not, the fact that a medieval institution outlived feudalism, plagues, and powdered wigs is nothing short of divine persistence. When you think of knights, you might picture sword fights, chivalry, and maybe a dramatic hair flip under a helmet. But behind the shining armor and epic jousts was a strict code of honor and a surprising sense of community service. Medieval knights weren't just muscle-bound tanks on horseback. They were expected to protect the weak, defend justice, and sometimes even help with charity events. While not all knights followed this noble ideal, some were more into looting than leading, the romanticized version stuck. Today, echoes of this medieval code survive in modern ideas of duty, volunteerism, and public service. So next time you see someone holding the door open for 20 people in a row, just know, a tiny knight lives inside them, whispering, For honor. Medieval art has made a surprising comeback, not in dusty museums, but in pop culture. Think dragons, knights, tapestries, and illuminated manuscripts, all revived in modern cartoons, board games, and music videos. Whether it's a metal band using Gothic fonts or a fantasy video game featuring hooded monks chanting ominously, the aesthetic of the Middle Ages is alive and well. The irony, much of this art was once painstakingly crafted by monks in silence. Now it's paired with rock guitar solos and memes. Yet somehow it works. The mystery, the symbolism, and the drama of medieval art continue to inspire, even when it's printed on a t-shirt or turned into a collectible card. Turns out, nothing says cool like a flaming sword and a haloed saint locked in eternal battle on your laptop wallpaper. The Middle Ages have made an epic comeback, not just in textbooks, but on your screen. Medieval imagery is everywhere, from Hollywood blockbusters with brooding knights and armored ladies, to video games where you slay dragons or manage your own plague-ridden village. Game developers and filmmakers seem to have a special fondness for mud, chainmail, and dramatic sword fights in the rain. Of course, not everything is historically accurate. Some peasants in games have better teeth than modern influencers. But who's complaining when the action is that good? The Middle Ages have become the ultimate backdrop for stories of valor, betrayal, and the occasional undead bishop. Whether you're binge-watching or button-mashing, you're living the medieval dream, minus the fleas. If you lived in the Middle Ages and someone sneezed, chances are you'd blame witches, demons, or the alignment of stars. Science? That's just suspicious wizardry. People believed that bathing too much was dangerous, black cats were evil incarnate, and bloodletting cured everything from headaches to heartbreaks. Thankfully, over time, reason tiptoed in like a shy monk. Thinkers started asking pesky questions like, what if illness isn't caused by sin? And should we stop drilling holes in people's heads? Slowly but surely, logic began replacing leeches. Today, we laugh at medieval superstitions, while still knocking on wood and reading our horoscopes. The biggest lesson? Even the darkest times can lead to enlightenment after enough trial and mostly fatal error. Let's get one thing straight. The Middle Ages were not just one long, gloomy winter filled with mud, plagues, and people yelling, "Heretic," every 5 minutes. Sure, they had their share of drama, crusades, inquisitions, knights forgetting their armor in the outhouse. But they also built cathedrals that still boggle modern engineers, preserved ancient texts, and invented universities. Yes, the same ones that now charge tuition like it's a royal ransom. Even the so-called Dark Ages had sparks of light. It wasn't all torch-waving mobs and leech-based medicine. So next time someone scoffs, ugh, so medieval, remind them that without the Middle Ages, we wouldn't have glasses, clocks, or the word booger. Okay, maybe not the last one, but still, it wasn't that dark after all. If you squint hard enough, or just read a few books, you'll see that modern society is really just a polished-up version of the Middle Ages. Bureaucracy? They had parchment pushers and tax collectors who made today's paperwork feel like a picnic. Social hierarchy? Let's not pretend our job titles and LinkedIn profiles aren't the new coats of arms. Public outrage? Medieval folks threw rotten tomatoes. Now we tweet angrily from the couch. Even the town square gossip has evolved into comment sections and viral memes. In short, the structures, habits, and quirks we live with today often have medieval roots. It's like the Middle Ages never left, just updated their wardrobe and got Wi-Fi. While medieval times didn't have Wi-Fi or oat milk lattes, they were rich in something we often lack: enduring values. Traditions like honoring family, keeping promises, even if made under duress by a sword, and respecting elders weren't just empty rituals. They were the glue of society. Modern folks might scoff at such old-fashioned ideas, but next time you're stuck in traffic because someone refused to yield, you might wish a chivalric code still applied. Even as the world speeds up, people still find comfort in annual festivals, Sunday dinners, and yes, calling grandma. These aren't just quirks, they're medieval values surviving the test of time. quietly reminding us that not all things old are obsolete. What can modern people learn from the medieval folks? Well, for starters, resilience. These were people who thought bathing once a month was luxury, ate porridge daily without complaint, and could survive a winter with just a fireplace, a cloak, and an unreasonable amount of faith. While today's minor inconvenience, like a weak Wi-Fi signal, might cause a meltdown, medieval peasants powered through plagues, famines, and wars with nothing but sheer stubbornness. There's something admirable and slightly terrifying about their mental fortitude. So next time your food delivery is late, remember, your ancestors probably walked barefoot through mud, in the rain, uphill, both ways. Bridging the past and the future isn't just for fantasy novels with wizards and portals. The cultural legacy of the Middle Ages is very real and very much alive. From town festivals that still follow medieval traditions to university gowns that look like they were designed by a tailor from the 13th century, we walk through echoes of the past every day. Even modern architecture sometimes borrows Gothic arches when it's feeling dramatic. Museums, music, family crests, and old cathedrals all connect us to ancestors who probably couldn't imagine smartphones, but definitely understood storytelling, honor, and the power of a good cloak. The thread may be old, but it hasn't snapped. It just got woven into a hoodie. And so, we bid farewell to the Middle Ages, not with a dramatic thunderclap or a knight riding into the sunset, but with a warm chuckle and a nod of respect. This was an era of contradictions, darkness and light, superstition and science, mud huts and soaring cathedrals. A time when a peasant might own 2 chickens and a dream, and a king might lose his throne over a bad haircut or a crusade gone sideways. Though we often laugh at their oddities, we owe much to their perseverance. Our journey through medieval Europe ends here, but its echoes remain, in stone, in stories, and in the suspiciously knight-like security guards at museums. The past isn't gone, it's just waiting for another curious mind to rediscover it, possibly while scrolling through this video at 2 a.m.